Resistance Radio is brought to you by Black Swan Outdoors. Our mission is to help you realize and develop your self-reliance, whether it's in the wilderness or the city center. All right, well, welcome back to Resistance Radio, and a couple updates on the blog. We had posted for Tradecraft Tuesday a article on escape and evasion. It's a part one of a two-part series where we're talking about the escape component and the evasion component. Starting out with evasion, kind of basically just saying, we need to focus on prevention before we focus on the escape part. And so I'm using evasion or evading the trouble in the first place as an example of that. So check that out definitely, and be on the lookout next Tuesday for part two in that installment. A couple other things. We've got a couple guests lined up for these podcasts. So we'll be doing some recording, hopefully this weekend, and then being able to get that out in the next couple weeks or so. So be also on the lookout for that. And then what else has we got? I think that's probably about it. So today we're going to talk about situational awareness. This was a post we had posted back in January. And it actually has been on the website for a while in a draft form. I wanted to get some ideas and some thoughts from other professionals in the field, other people's perspectives in this as we're kind of developing kind of a new look or a new view of situational awareness. So the post is entitled Condition White, Rethinking Situational Awareness in the Face of Cultural Threat. Now, originally I thought about reading this to you, and I might go back with some of the Tradecraft Tuesdays and be able to do that, for example, with this last one. However, this particular post is quite long, and I think it's probably better, you're probably better to read it yourself. So what I'm going to try to do is kind of talk about this the concept of situational awareness, and I also want to talk about it in context of our culture, I guess you could say. So where the threats really rely in our culture, and how we can be more situationally aware, not only in general, but more specifically into the dangers, I guess you could say, of our cultures. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of really highlight in this post is the fact that there is this huge disconnect between the dangers of far-right ideology with what I'll say right of center or conservative culture in America. That the conservative culture doesn't see this because maybe it's because they're just so close to it, or that they identify with certain aspects of the far right. And I've had conversations with people on multiple ends of the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right. And what's interesting is I think a lot of people feel that they unfairly get wrapped up into far right ideology, being right of center, being a Trump supporter, being conservative, and what have you. However, there is a larger cultural embracing that's happening where it's becoming more and more socially acceptable. And some of this stuff has to do with this disinformation campaigns, primarily in mass media and social media, which we are going to have. I've mentioned this in the previous podcast that we were going to have a conversation on this, and we will, because I think that is definitely important. But I think we need to be really aware of our surroundings and where we're at. And so there's this kind of idea or this mentality, perspective that there are these sheepdog type people in the world, and that they are the protectors of society. And these sheepdogs see themselves in a position where they're protecting greater society, but they're stuck, unfortunately, in this conservative culture, and they're only preserving their aspects of culture. And in doing so, I think is they're completely isolating themselves from the larger culture, larger conversation. And so they feel left out of these conversations because they don't understand why other people view right of center more broadly, but very specifically the far right as a threat to society. So for example, people go out on gun ranges and do hand-to-hand combat training and knife fighting and all this kind of crazy wild stuff. Um, but it's all being taught to primarily kind of this fighting age male um, demographic. Well, when you kind of step back from it and you look at who are the people that are most violent, it's going to always be the fighting age white male. All of that testosterone, um, and um, and just by the sake that white people are predominant in our culture, you're always going to have that. You can't escape that. So when you are faced with real threats and you do want to get help, say you want to learn how to fire a weapon, you feel threatened by your life, or you feel like you need to learn self-defense, or what have you, you have to be willing essentially to cross this political Rubicon and go into an area where there's a lot of people who are very right of center in thought, and also accept, welcome sometimes, right of far right ideology. So it's not a mystery to anybody. Anyone that's gone to a gun range or a gun store, for example, is going to be used to seeing, um, right of politics or even conspiratorial, they're going to experience comments from people that are uh, that are in reference. I mean, I've been to a couple gun ranges where I've seen people hanging posters about conspiracy theories, um, and for example, anti-Obama conspiracy theories. I've been in classes with people who make comments that are racially derogatory because they're in an all-white environment. Like I've seen this stuff myself, and I think it's the view, it's the perspective that a lot of people have. So if you want to get into firearms, you are very much, you have to basically swallow and just take it, um, or spend a lot of time and energy finding the people who are similar in thought that you are, in terms of these dangers. The gun industry has doubled down for a long time, in particular, on the basically 25% of our population that has 90% of the firearms. They know that it's a harder sell to sell liberals, guns, when liberals want to, quote unquote, remove their guns, when in fact they just want regulation. Most people want some form of regulation. Most of America does not want guns to be removed. They just want sensible legislation to protect our children and people in our community. Because when you look at the real statistics of gun violence, it's more often that guns create more trouble than it is less. As much as I personally like guns and I want to support the Second Amendment, we have to be true about these statistics. And so when we look at things like these threats that are happening within our communities, people actually targeting individuals that are gay for the fact that they're being gay, or that they're part of BLM, or whatever it is, that they don't have places to go because the entire industry kind of doubled down on the white male patriarchy, and has created this situation because they're completely unaware of what's really happening, that's actually destroying themselves in many ways. So anyway, I'm kind of go off a little bit of a tangent, but that's basically kind of the gist of it. So when you go to, get a when you go to get, situational awareness training, it's going to be in a gun range, it's going to be in self-defense areas, and the predominant customer there and everything is focused on that white male, demographic. And so we're missing out. Basically, what I'm saying is we're missing out on the real victims of domestic violence. The immigrants, the refugees, women, the LGBTQ community, People who are truly subjected to violence on a day-to-day basis, versus those who are kind of that fighting age male mentality or demographic, who posed absolutely no risk at all. If I was going to target somebody for an assault, would I go for a young, strong male as a target, or would I go for a small, weaker in stature woman or minority person or whomever? And so the culture of violence that people assume because they believe that they're capable of it, are the ones who are perpetuating the threats in our society in many ways. And so when we're taught situational awareness, we're taught it in a completely different, wrong, and very unhelpful way, because we're taught as if it's like some kind of color code system, like after 9/11, of being in different states of awareness. And so where that kind of came from was Colonel Cooper, who is a self-defense author and trainer, who wrote Principles of Self-Defense. And in that book, he talks about situational awareness. And the root of his introduction to situational awareness in firearms training came in the mental preparation that you need to go through to fire that weapon. So when he served in the military, he was working with young soldiers who are incapable of firing their weapons, and this is a problem that has always beleaguered the military. And if you want to have a conversation about that, we certainly can. I don't want to go too far down into tangents, but basically what he was saying is that there needs to be kind of a red line in the sand, so to speak, and you need to prepare your mind. You need to prepare your mind to be able to fire that weapon and prepare that condition. So you're conditioning your mind to that reaction. So you're using situational awareness to see into the future, to see how you're going to react into that scenario. So you don't have to waste time in making a decision of whether or not you're going to fire your weapon or not. So he created these states of awareness in which white would be you're in a safe environment. There's no action, nothing required. Yellow is an environment that there's a specific threat. There is no specific threat, but you should probably remain a little bit aware. Orange represents that there is a possibility that there is a threat possible, and that you do need to stay focused in that situation. And red is that condition that you've created in which you are going to use potential lethal action. And so you're preparing yourself for a response to a specific threat. And so if you just have this sense of awareness, like, oh, I'm always in condition yellow, or I'm always in condition orange, or whatever it is, you're just going to be wearing yourself down, and you're not really going to be noticing the real threats around you, especially if anything could be potentially a threat. So another area where they teach situational awareness, which is rooted in some kind of logic, is being able to see and memorize everything in your environment, and that's completely impossible. You can't do it. It's physically, mentally, and emotionally impossible to be absorbent of everything in your environment. So there's always this example of Jason Bourne in the scene in the movie where he's like, oh, I know this guy, the license plate number of this, and I know the guy who's got a gun, and so on and so forth. And the reality is that you just want to be cognizant of the real threats that are out there and be able to make those real decisions. And so by just increasing your mental capacity to memorize things doesn't mean that you're making the right decisions on what you need to do. You're wasting time and energy. So we don't want to waste our time and energy on frivolous memories. We want to condition our mind so that we can remember the things that we need to, which is one thing, because if we only have so much intelligence, you can't make yourself smarter. You can work at it, you can try it. It's a lot harder to do than it is to be able to just work on your memory and being able to increase your memory. So most people have plateau at their mental capacity, but our ability to grow and expand our ability to remember things is completely different. So when we look at the traditional definition of situational awareness, that definition, I'll read it to you here, um, is the use of the sensory system to scan an environment with the purpose of identifying threats in the present or projecting those threats into the future. And I think when we kind of take that definition, we start trying to break that down. I think what's lost on a lot of people is that you have to be looking for those specific threats. You have to be able to be projecting into the future to see what's going to happen and how are you going to react, so that you can just do that. So you can just react, and that's probably the most traditional kind of um, um, widely used definition, I guess you'd say. I think that was I think I've grabbed that from Wikipedia. But basically, the idea here is that our mind is kind of works subconsciously and it works consciously, and we can be more aware of things, being more in the state of consciousness. So when we're driving, oftentimes we fall into the state of unconsciousness. We're just kind of moving through the motions. We're conscious, but we're not. We might be thinking about other things. We might be listening to the radio. So the mind is just going to be, mind takes the path of least resistance like anything else. And so it's just going to always be in a state of laziness, in a sense. And we want to be active. We want to keep that mind active. And so Aaron Haskins, who is a former combat veteran, wrote about this kind of concept in Breach Bang Clear blog, and to talk about this disconnect, that we have this deliberate mind, as he said, that we can, in a sense, control, but we think that it can multitask. We think that it can be totally absorbent to everything around us, and that's just not the case. We can only really truly focus on one thing. So for example, I had a dog that had some anxiety with thunderstorms, and the best thing you can do, because it's got a very simple mind, is just take the dog for a walk. He can only concentrate on one thing at a time. So I could put a leash on him inside the house and walk him around the house, and in seconds, the dog is totally at ease because he's only thinking about what we're doing, which is walking around the house. And so our mind is the same thing. We're not that much different. And I think that, so we kind of fall into this idea of situational awareness being this, kind of monk-like status in your mind, and that we kind of blow it up to being more than what it really is. And I'm, to be clear, I like to kind of lump situational awareness into what I call the Jedi Knight skills. These kind of soft power skills that you can use that are very helpful. And so I'm not going to deny that I haven't been part of that by labeling it part of some kind of mythic, warrior monk perspective. But let's be real here. I mean, we can all attain the ability for situational awareness, just like some of the other skills, which I had put on the podcast before, and I'll probably either redevelop and post back up or just post those back up. But, how do you assess personalities? How do you detect if someone's lying to you? Situational awareness. Even I think part of that, the concept of the gray man kind of stuff kind of falls a little bit into that as well. So there's all these kind of skills, these kind of soft power skills that we can use in kind of broader sense of defense to mitigate future troubles or kind of move us through situations before we get to that point of violence. And situational awareness kind of sits into that. So what happens in these firearm communities when they're teaching it, they kind of throw this in with other topics just to kind of give some more depth and perspective, because they're, oftentimes these guys charge a huge amount of money. And so they start referencing things like the ODA loop and all this other stuff that's not really applicable. And they basically kind of take these more complex concepts and try to dumb that down, water that down into something that really it's lost its meaning in many ways. So Micah Ensley, she's a PhD. She was a former scientist for the Air Force. She has a really interesting perspective on situational awareness. Her definition is a little bit different. And her definition is the perception of environmental elements and the events with respect to time or space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of the future status. And I think that this really kind of encompasses more of what we really need to be thinking about in terms of situational awareness, that it's much more than just knowing what's around you in your environment. It's much more broader than that. And I think we need to take that 20,000 view feet instead of that 5,000 view foot look around us as we are approaching situational awareness. So what she has done is she kind of breaks down into situational awareness into 3 different levels. The first level is perception. So we are going to be perceptive of our surroundings, which also includes reading body language, similar to kind of left of bang, and that perspective of situational awareness, which we'll talk about later on, and is important. But we're also looking at statistical data about potential threats. We're also conversing and talking to other people who have been in these experiences so that we can gain more experience, essentially. Because I think that's what it comes down to, is if you want to make better judgment, you need better experience or more experience. The more experience you have, the better ability you have in judging and making judgments. So everything from those body languages to atmospherics, to everything that's kind of around you in this context, a place where there might of war or gang violence or things that are abstract, we need to understand how that all kind of translates into our environment, essentially. Her next level is comprehension, and this is where basically you take this information that you've gathered and then you analyze it. So again, it's not just memorizing the things around you, it's thinking about, okay, should I file this away? Should I not file this away, right? There's no sense. I like to use the example of a penny. Everyone has seen a penny a million times. But if I was to say, draw a penny, and then compare what you've drawn on that penny to what is actually on the penny, there's probably a few things. People might remember the date, and they might remember Lincoln's head, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, the penny is identified by its color and Lincoln primarily, and so those are the 2 most important things. Everything else, the fact that you can see Lincoln in the memorial on the back, is insignificant in its use as a penny, right? So we'll take a more contemporary example. Kyle Rittenhouse, who was a kid that joined up with a militia in Kenosha and fired upon 2 protesters, looters, protesters. His only tool was an AR-15, which means he only had one reaction, which was deadly force. And there's this assumption by the militia that the crowd would respect that presentation of power. And all it was the presence of the militia at that moment. And as any other context in which militias, these private militias, come out into public, is bluffing. They're just bluffing with power. And that bluff was called, and he fired a weapon. So the only choice he had was deadly escalation. That was it. He was, there was no escape, there was no help, there was no team support. And then by breaking the law in the first place, by being there and being in the context of having openly carrying a weapon and so on, he's also lost that moral high ground. So regardless of whether the case says, yes, he was in self-defense or not, he was still breaking the law. Just like gangbangers, go and shoot each other. You don't have the blood shooting the Crips, and you don't have someone from the Bloods at court saying, well, it was in self-defense. No, It doesn't work like that. And so it'd be interesting to see where the case goes with this. But the idea here is that they're so situationally unaware of what they were doing, of what they were walking into, that it was mind-numbingly stupid. Just as so many of these force reaction response that you have to, in the vigilantism that comes out of the militia movement. So level 3 is projection. This is taking into account the information that you have gathered, you've perceived, analyzed, and then use that to predict what could happen. So you start looking into the future to, okay, what could potentially happen in this situation, and what am I going to do about it? And you're building plans. You're kind of putting together plans, what if scenarios. And I think that in any survival context, you're always thinking, what if, what if, what if, what if. And you're not thinking that while you're in that process. It's better to think about what if beforehand. Not saying you need to be paranoid, but you need to think about it. So if you do a lot of backpacking or canoeing or whatever, wilderness travel, you're always thinking about, okay, well, what if I lose my pack? What if I don't know, go into a storm? What if I get delayed off on the trail, not being able to come back at the time that I'm expecting to? What if, what if, what if? And you're thinking about these things, so you have a plan in place should those things happen. And again, the more experiences you have, the more likelihood you know of these particular events happening, and you mitigate that. So, for example, a backpacker, a first-time backpacker, always packs more food than they need. Always, 100% of the time. And it's because they've never backpacked before. They don't know how much food they're going to have, and they need to have that comfort of food with them so that they don't go hungry. Because it's, for a lot of Americans, it's a huge fear. And so as you go through the trails, through life and hit more trails and get more experience, you start understanding your body's ability to consume energy, at what level, at what temperature, and you start being able to pack the amount of calories that you need that's appropriate for that trip. And that's just something that you can only get over the course of time, knowing yourself. You could read about it. They can give you guidelines and say, well, you need 2,000 calories in the fall, and you need 4,000 calories in the winter, and you need this. It comes down to individual experience, what you're doing, and who you are in many cases. And situational awareness is about that. And you need to be more and more self-aware, essentially. So, the bottom line here is that the demographic who is also the safest from threats of physical attack, kidnapping, domestic violence, rape, and other are not this main demographic that the industry caters to. And I think that this is a huge example of not being situationally aware, especially as fast and as dynamic as things are changing right now. So in the blog, I use some examples. Molly Tibbetts became a very household name because she was a jogger, a young girl jogging on a rural road in the middle of Iowa. She was picked up. Someone saw her, picked her up, put her in a trunk. My guess is probably to assault her. He got scared and ashamed, and his response then was to kill her, dump the body, and they found him. The reason why she became a household name is for two reasons. One, she was a white young girl in Iowa. Now that story in itself is sensational, that anyone and everyone, even in rural Iowa, could be at risk of abduction. But most importantly, she was a young white woman. Now, Hispanic girls, black girls, get picked up off the street and they don't even get an Amber Alert. But oftentimes, when people who are not often subjected to this kind of violence, where it's less quote unquote commonplace, it's more sensationalized. The news media picks that up and runs with it. because it can get great viewers. People just expect, in many ways, violence to be happening in the kind of the lower rungs of our society, right? But for the middle class white girl, this is big news. But the other element to this, the third part of this, was that she was also being attacked by a Mexican American. And it fit the political narrative of Donald Trump's idea that immigrants and refugees were coming over our border to rape our women, to take our jobs, to ruin our society. But around that same time, we didn't hear about Elizabeth Flores, a mom of two who had been found beaten to death and all of her teeth been pulled out and her scalp removed. I mean, we didn't hear about her. We didn't hear about LaToya Clay, who was shot and killed by her husband in an argument. Because these names don't matter. They don't fit the political narrative, and they don't fit the right identity. And so when we make these decisions about our, politics and how we see the world, essentially our situational awareness of the world, we become blinded by other people's narratives. And we just get caught up into some crazy thoughts. So when no one ever on the right, everyone wants to attack BLM and Antifa and say, oh, they're the greatest threat to mankind right now, or through the summer. But then they're also the biggest pussies in the world. You can't have it both ways. They don't really know what they're saying. They're just repeating information that they hear. They're blinded to this sense of reality, and this kind of goes into that whole disinformation campaign that has been happening in these kind of two realities, these bespoke realities that we're starting to see. And so politics has a lot to do with this, and this is why my blog focuses a lot on politics and the politics of the coronavirus. I mean, there was all these trainers. I listen to other podcasts of firearms trainers and first aid and things like that. And, there's a guy who's a paramedic who's talking about the coronavirus not being a problem. Fast forward 3 weeks and 400,000 people are dead. No recognition of the real threat in our society. People are talking about masks and all this stuff, and it's a joke. They're creating an environment in which is more dangerous and less safe because they're not situationally aware. So bottom line here is that many trainers that are out there are situationally unaware of the demographics they serve and the real threats in the environment. They use sensationalism, they use politics to scare people into their classes, and they keep the real people, the real victims, outside of their classes. So here's an example. You'll see a class that teach you need to be tactically parking your car, right? Okay, well, that makes sense. You go to the grocery store and you have to tactically park in that parking stall. Well, when you're talking to a group of men who very rarely go, and I'm sorry, I'm being a little stereotypical here, but when you're talking to a group of men who very rarely go out into the supermarket to actually go shopping, the guys that you see at the supermarket walking around like they're completely, lost. You come back to your car that's tactically parked. How are you going to get the groceries into the trunk? So unpractical. So when you're talking to a group of women, let's say, that do this shopping, they know that you want to pull in so that you have access to your trunk to do what you need to do. You create these security measures that they're based on nothing. There's no threat. If there's no threat, then why inconvenience yourself? It doesn't make sense. There's that disconnect, right? So the other example I hear of of they're all, and it always happens. Every example in situational awareness, someone talks about the urban kid with an iPod on a bus or a train or whatever, walking. And I love this one because they completely are unaware of the environment in which that kid is in. So when if you've commuted before, like let's say in a train or a bus or whatever, and you're on a particular schedule, most of the people with you are on that same schedule. If let's say you work 9 to 5, it's 5 o'clock, and everyone's going in the same direction as you, back home. A good majority of the people on that bus or that train are going to be the same people you see every day or weekly or whatever. And furthermore, they're still your neighbors. Just because you don't know them doesn't make them a threat. And so, yeah, when you want to escape the city and listen to some music and be in conditioned white, you can do that when you trust your neighbors. But if you don't trust anybody, then you have to wear a concealed weapon all the time. Because if you don't know your situation and you're just going to blanketly distrust everything, you need to be armed. And so the same people won't travel internationally, for example, because you can't wear a concealed weapon abroad. Because America is one of the few developed places that allows concealed carry. The gun becomes a crutch to your safety. You no longer have to think about situational awareness, ironically. And so by picking on kids primarily, right? I mean, I've seen a trainer, a well-known YouTube, defense, survival, all that stuff, teaching situational awareness, literally teaching situational awareness while he's driving in a car with the phone mounted. I mean, how is that being situationally aware when you're driving a multi-ton vehicle going, I don't know how fast he was going, whatever, 30 miles an hour, whatever. Think of the damage you can make this is crazy. Like, people think that they're more in danger than they are because it's important to be marketed that way. So when you go to Chili's, no one cares. There's no Sicario that's going to bust down the door to shoot you while you're having dinner with your family. They talk about, oh, you got to be situationally aware. So you sit at the table so that you can see the door. Okay. Well, what you're saying is your wife incapable or your partner incapable of being situationally aware as well? I mean, what makes you the ability to know the situation more than her? That you have to put her with their back to the door. Oh, and by the way, let's say someone did come in to shoot. She's across the table now from you. She's your human shield. I mean, you start looking at these things, these tropes and these things that keep repeated, and it's so mindlessly repeated. People aren't really thinking of the real situation that they're in. You're not a mob boss. No one's going to bust down the door of Chili's while you're eating your chicken tenders. I guarantee you're going to be fine. You can go out and eat without a weapon. You can go and meet people and ride the bus and be safe. The narrative of we either live in an extremely dangerous society and everyone needs weapons when the manufacturers need that cash, or we live in an extremely safe society where no one ever uses an AR-15 in a mass shooting, or the potential of that, or the statistics of that is very small when laws want to come around. We've got to find a reality. We can't live in this politically hyped environment where we don't really know what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. We don't really know who is dangerous when they are. So experience matters. Experience matters. So to use the hiking analogy again, I like, when you take or an outdoor analogy, when you take a look at like outdoor skills, and people are like, oh, they want to learn how to do bow drill, right? You got to have $300 survival knife. I want to learn how to do my bow drill so I can survive out in the woods. Well, I guarantee you, if you pack appropriately, if you understand how to layer your clothing, you've got proper equipment, proper planning in that trip, you're not going to need any of that skill sets. No one ever uses bow drill even in an emergency environment, because it's not even a guaranteed method. Even if you're super skilled at it, and you can be, if you're in a survival situation, you're cold, the wood's wet, you're hypothermic, you're gonna have the dexterity to do that. What if there's a lot of what ifs. But that $300 survival knife and bushcraft course is so sexy, when you could just have a map and compass skills and not be in that problem in the first place. I've hiked hundreds of miles. I've been bewildered. I've been turned around, but you can easily find your way out of that. But it's sexy, it's fun, and I'm not knocking it. There's a lot of fun in that kind of stuff. You just have to be realistic about that skill set, that real possibility. And a lot of people from YouTube or wherever, they don't want to teach you reality. They want to teach you, motivate you with fear to get you into their courses. A lot of people take first aid classes without even having any intention of doing, first aid on a stranger. They like the idea of it. And people like the idea of being vigilant. But, at the end of the day, you have to do something, and you have to be willing to do something. And that's part of that being situationally aware, is making decisions so that you can make a decision to do something. And that's what's so important about this. Because if you don't make a decision on what to do, then being situationally aware, being open to seeing everything around you, makes absolutely no sense. There has to be action. There has to be an action to it. So you have to focus on the things that can remove good judgment and correct these things first before you can even work on your situational awareness. If you've got bad judgment, then you're never going to be in a state of situational awareness. So there's all sorts of things. Delusion of grandeur, that's huge. Fixating on stuff. Ignoring bad news when it comes to you. Physical stressors, mental stressors, the capacity to cope, stress in itself. All these things are built through experience, but also it helps you become more situationally aware. You can't be situationally aware entirely if you're so mentally or physically or emotionally stressed. So you have to understand how to deal with stressors, and that's going to help through judgment. And anxiety is the fear of something that could potentially happen to you in the future. And it's irrational. And that anxiety can stop you from making the right decisions that you need to, which means making you less situationally aware. There's other behaviors that I see a lot within people that are, anti-authority, impulsivity, vulnerable, macho. Are these the traits of people that you know? These are the very things that keep you from being situationally aware. Just blanketly disregarding anything that the government says because it's the government means that you want to be unaware of what's going on in the world. Thinking that nothing can happen to you because you're so highly trained, Mr. Navy SEAL or whatever, means that you're completely situationally unaware. Impulsivity, jumping into situations without stopping and thinking about what you're doing, means that you're unsituationally aware. Thinking that you're better than everyone else, that you've got the better training, better experience. Oh, you were in the military? So what? I like the adage in climbing, in the climbing world, is that there are old climbers and there are bold climbers, but there are no old climbers. And that's what awareness is about. And these political biases that we have that I talk a lot about and a lot of people hate and they don't want to follow me or whatever because they get upset because I make them feel bad. It's ruining our ability to be situationally aware. The pandemic, Donald Trump's failed policies, pushed good, hardworking, well-intended Americans to stopping the democratic process. They aided and abetted in essentially what is fascism. And we'll get into that later. They wanted to end democracy, the foundation of our society. They couldn't see it. They weren't aware of the situation that they were in. So we need to be processing this information, thinking about the information that's around us, and working with our environment to see that whole picture, right? Think about that concept of that automatic mind, and you can go back to the article and read more about that if you're interested in that. But Aaron Haskins from the article, Breach Blame Clear, was talking about Gary Klein's research on recognition prime decision making, or just understanding patterns. And I think that understanding patterns is super, super important in how we understand situational awareness. And I think that there's a feeling of like the QAnon supporters, and then they are pushed out of kind of the greater discourse of the world in many ways, but they feel that they can be powerful or they can be a participant because they can do their own, what they think is research and understanding the world. And so they basically are creating their own patterns, and those patterns are completely unrealistic. So much so that one guy grabbed a gun to go to a pizza parlor thinking that there was this sex trafficking happening in the basement. And there was no basement. Most of the stuff that people, like her or not, more than half the stuff that people say about Hillary Clinton and the Clinton family is complete bullshit. I mean, and there's are you a tool? Are you being a tool by industry and by the political machine to see the world that they want you to see? Can you critically think about some of these things? Have you really had conversations about this? And so sometimes this information is hard to process in a world that we're in because a lot of people get left out in understanding the intricacies and the complexities of the environment that we're in. And I get that. And there are a lot of people with a great amount of education, for example, you could get a degree in economics and not fully understand how the global economy works. I mean, that's totally possible in this day and age. So I'm not ragging on people that are just uneducated. Educated people can also be just as blind to the world. So when I use an example in the blog of the CDC and COVID, and when they talk about flattening the curve, it falls short on most people because nobody really understands what that means. So officials are looking at all sorts of aspects of that disease and how it's affecting our society. They're looking at the availability of resources, the financial capacity of a specific area. I mean, that could be a town, it could be a county. The supply chains, the geographic variances, all of these factors are weighed into making the decisions on how to react. It's not just one guy in shirt sleeves and a pocket protector and glasses just saying, hey, we need to shut down these restaurants for no reason. So we got to flatten the curve. It's such a technical term and a complex process. We need to trust people that they're smarter than us, that they know what's going on. I'm not saying being blind to corruption or stuff. We have to stop thinking that just because you're from the government that you've got bad intent, or because you're a scientist or whatever that position of authority is or position of expertise is in. I don't want to go in surgery with a person that doesn't know and hasn't experienced other surgeries before and doesn't know what he's doing. And I don't think you would either. So this elitism, this defiance to government for the sake of being defiant, makes absolutely no sense. So the question is how can you say that you're situationally aware if you can't tell the difference between what is a real threat and a perceived threat? So one thing I like to talk about is Carl Weick, and he's a social scientist. And I'll talk a little bit more about Carl Weick on this post than what I talked about specifically in his sense-making work. And sense-working is basically making sense of the environment around you through your observations. So there's a list of these different aspects or properties of sense-making that I have in there. I don't. You can, if you want, you can go and read it. But here's a little thing about understanding, because when we talk about understanding our baseline or focus locks and all this other stuff that we're going to talk about in a second, we actually have to understand how our mind works. And I think that Carl Weick kind of talked about or describes this process in probably one of the best ways. And so envision in your mind, when you look out into any environment that you're at, envision in your mind all these little dots all over the place. And all these little dots represents the sounds, the sights, the things that you can see and observe around you. And what you do is you take these, let's say, 100 dots, and your mind only has the capacity to really conceptualize a few of those dots. So we'll take, I don't know, a quarter of them, 25 of these dots, and you isolate those dots that you can see. This is why some people can perceive some things in an environment, and other people can look back in their memory and remember something completely different. Because we can only focus on those things. And sometimes we focus on those things that are most familiar to us, or they reinforce the things that, history, past, whatever. And this is how that automatic mind works, right? So it's things that are very familiar to us, these motions of driving and whatnot. So then what we tried to do, that next step, is we try to take those 25 things, and we try to make sense out of those in structure. So we try to structure those things. We create those things and we put them into a mental circle or a mental square. And then from there, we can isolate a few of those things that we've now trying to understand to fully remember, to fully encompass. So if you want to be more situationally aware, more observant, you need to be able to break the lazy mind's ability to start organizing and structuring the environment around you, so you can start focusing on the real threats, the reality that's around you. So every environment has a baseline. And the baseline is that these individual patterns that we have that we use to make sense out of that reality. And a big part of that baseline is how we've been socialized, how we see the world. these little cues and these things that we're picking up that have meaning to us. And we tend to focus on those specific but limited amount of information. So in order to see threats, we need to be able to understand what those threats are and focus on the real threats, not the perceived threats. So the baseline provides you something in which a context in which you can monitor. And that context is fluid. And it requires that conscious effort. It requires that conscious mind. You can't be lazy about that. You have to be open to it. You have to be woke to it, I guess. And this is critical. The question is, too, does the baseline of your environment create you? So I like to use the example of hiking in the woods. People say, well, you need to go out in the woods and get your baseline. That's a good way to practice. Well, just the fact that you are in the woods is going to alter the baseline of that environment. And so if you're unaware of how the environment reacts without you, you'll never know how the environment is reacting with you in there. So for example, turkeys have a complex form of language. They have different clicks and clucks that mean specific things. A rattlesnake, for example, is this. A hawk would be another. And so you could be out in the woods, being completely unaware, thinking that you're part of the baseline, you're understanding that baseline, and the turkeys are talking to each other with using a click to indicate that there's a human there. Or a blue jay's alarm call. What does that mean, right? How those animals are moving and interacting in the environment is being altered by you. But if you don't know this, then you have no idea what that real baseline is, I guess. So we talked a little bit earlier about Left to Bang, fantastic book about situational awareness. It was Left to Bang, How the Marine Corps Combat Hunter Program Can Save Your Life. It was written by two Marines, Patrick Van Horn, Jason Riley, and they were basically lessons and analysis of war and how that program, that combat hunter program, could be used as profiling to establish situational awareness within soldiers, and basically can build off of the intuition and of a hunter. I keep saying hunter, of a soldier, to anticipate an impending attack, right? So Left to Bang basically means to be on the right, being on the right side of the timeline of identifying or an IED or a potential shooter. And so that means to be on that right side, you need to be aware of your surroundings, aware of what's happening around you before it becomes deadly. So being on the right side of that timeline means that you've survived. Being left to bang means that you've used that situational awareness to thwart or circumvent a violent incident. So they break it down in the book, 6 different areas: kinetics, biometrics, polymetrics, geographics, iconography, atmospherics, all of these things that they use to observe behavior and understand what's going on around you. To understand that context, to get that right baseline so that you can start making those right decisions. Another area of situational awareness that I think is important to talk about too are these focus locks, these ideas that one person, your mind can only focus on one thing at a time. We often call that you can call it highway hypnosis, you could call it whatever you want while you're driving, but your eyes need to keep moving to see through your rearview mirror. And think about, and it's happened to me, where you're driving on a dark highway, miles after miles after miles, and you don't even notice that a cop car is behind you because your eyes aren't moving to your rearview mirror, and they're not even noticing the lights. And you go for, a mile or, whatever it is, a few seconds until your mind kind of breaks out of it, and you're like, oh man, I'm getting pulled over, right? This is a lack of situational awareness. And so sometimes we focus in on things so much that we become completely unaware of a situation. And so what we need to know is that we can fall into these focus locks, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that in the right environment that we're not so focused that it puts us into, subjects us to danger. So environments where you're transitioning from one environment to another is a place where you don't want to be focus locked. So we talk about that kid with the iPad. He's in a safe environment when he's sitting on the bus, but when he's moving from one environment to the next environment, perhaps, maybe not. Maybe that's not the appropriate time to be focus locked. Taxi stands at airports, hotel lobbies, places where potential criminals can be, IEDs can be set, things like that are places where you don't want to be focus locked. You want to be aware. There's places like choke points on bridges, road construction areas, tunnels, places where ambushes could be set up. Those are places you don't want to be focus locked in. You want to be aware and attentive. So you want to be proactive. Scan your environment. Look for those potential threats before you put yourself into a situation where you want to be concentrating on the task at hand. The next thing we'll talk about is normalcy bias, and this is how people react to their stressors and how they react differently. So we talked a lot about earlier in the blog post about how stress and incomplete information can make people less aware. Oftentimes, too much information, analysis paralysis can happen, and your mind just cannot focus on what's really dangerous. Too much information is being set out. Again, this was the coronavirus. Everyone wants to know early on in the virus. Everyone wants to know everything they can about the virus. But that doesn't necessarily make you any more safe, because that information changes over the course of time as we understand the virus more. So oftentimes, sometimes we don't comprehend a danger. We create excuses around those dangers. We become stubborn to change. We completely deny the existence of these dangers. And our mind just falls back into a normal response. We just want to get back to normal behavior. So the mask is a good example of this. The mask becomes a symbol of this virus. Well, we have economic troubles. We have the pandemic. We have racial injustice happening. We have all of this political stuff happening in our environment. Everything is so unstable. And people are just like, they're not pushing back on the mask because it makes them safer. They're pushing back on it because they want to get back to a normal life that they used to have. And that mask becomes a symbol of that. They just want it normal again. And they're triggered by it. This is an emotional trigger. So, what do we do to learn a little more about situational awareness, and what can we do to be more proactive in learning more about our situational awareness? I say travel. I think probably the best class in situational awareness that you can do is to travel as much as you can. Travel really gets your mind working, get you to be able to perceive reality in a very different way. Even if it's local travel, even if it's just going out and experiencing life, sitting down at a park bench and watching people to traveling into new areas. If you've never taken mass transportation before, go into a city and do it. All of these, do these things where you're active, you're involved, and I think travel represents a great way to do that. Break down um, the the construction of your life, the reality in which you've built up around you by forcing yourself into new environments, new people, understanding how that relates to tribalism, how it relates to how people react um, to you being different or you being in a different scenario, in different situations. And I think that is a great jumping off point. And then, more experience you have, the more, more understanding you have about your environment around you. Because in this environment that we're in, um, it's about adaptation. When technology moves fast, when information moves fast, if you're incapable of change, then you're going to be left behind very quickly. And I think that's the fundamental problem, one of the fundamental problems of why conservatism is such a dangerous thing in our culture today, is because there's some people within there. Conservatism in principle is good. It's about putting brakes on to quick liberal change, and understanding that real change is slow change, and understanding that there is value in tradition and patriotism. But when you push it too far, too fast as a reaction, then really bad things happen. And those really bad things is what we're experiencing right now. So another technique that you can do is what's called self-distancing. Self-distancing is basically trying to create outer body experiences. And I know this sounds a little foo-foo, but I think it's really good. And it's something that comes out of the acting world. Actors do this. You can create a whole new identity for yourself, where you're removing yourself from your shoes, essentially, and thinking about yourself in a different context. You remove yourself from yourself to create kind of a psychological distance. And you can do this by trying to emulate behaviors and people. This is where actors do, putting yourself into those people's shoes, and creating a psychological distance between yourself and the world around you, so that, like traveling, it's like traveling outside of your body in a way, mentally. It's like a mental travel in a way. And so if you're good at this, or you practice this, you can develop an alter ego, which is an extreme example of self-distancing. You can create a superhero who is within you, in which you can consult with to provide and give you encouragement. So you can use this person that you've created in order to get you through what you need to get through in many ways. And what that's going to do is it's going to help temper some of that anxiety. It's going to help control those irrational fears that you have. It's going to boost your ability to control yourself. And if you can control yourself, you can control your mind. If you can control your mind, you can see more, you can see those threats around you. And who wouldn't want more confidence? Who wouldn't want more assurance in any situation? Anxiety does a horrible thing. Irrational fear is a horrible thing in keeping you less safe, for all the things that we've been talking about. And if you want to get more into that, there's a great book called The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBeck. Fantastic. I think I have a link on that on the website. I'm pretty sure I do. So the last thing is ego. And ego is something that is really, really important. So when we talk a lot about spy stuff and spy skills and all that stuff in this blog, right? And the number one thing that an operative is going to use to get somebody to spy on their country is not money, but ego. That is the Achilles heel for most people. And I think that understanding your ego is really, really important. And we've talked a little bit about this in other posts, but it goes to that point. If you want to get to that next level, that Jedi Knight skill level, that warrior monk level of defense, you've got to be able to get over that ego hump. And it takes a lot of practicing, daily practice to do that. And you have to be very much aware of everything that's around you. So Carl Jung had this great quote here, and I'll use that just in kind of some final words. As you're trying to find your way on this path of enlightenment and removing your ego, Jung says, filling the conscious mind with the ideal conceptions is a characteristic of Western philosophy, but not the confrontation of the shadow and the world of darkness. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. There is evil and darkness in this world, and facing the darkness takes courage, perseverance, and self-discipline. This path will make you become more aware of your own suffering, your own faults, and your false beliefs. And I think that is a scary thing. It's a very scary thing when we're thinking about how we are going to approach this and relieving ourselves from this ego and finding our path for better and stronger and more effective situational awareness. So with that, we've got more content, more things happening. I'll probably do a little rundown similar to this on the blog of Escape and Evasion. I might just wait until we have the second posting to do this. We've got more content coming and more exciting things happening in the wings. So with that, thank you for listening, and we really appreciate your support, and stay safe out there. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please visit our blog for articles and more information at www.blackswanoutdoors.com, or check us out on Instagram.